The most terrifying aspect of this story isn't that hundreds of people danced themselves to death. It's that they couldn't stop even when they wanted to. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy mysterious and unexplained true events, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss our new uploads. Now, let's begin. On a sweltering July day in 1518, the residents of Strasbourg were going about their daily business in the narrow, crowded streets of the medieval city. Strasbourg was then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a bustling trade center known for its magnificent cathedral and thriving markets. But on this particular day, something happened that would transform the city into the site of one of history's most bizarre and disturbing mass phenomena. A woman known to history as Frau Trophia stepped into the middle of a busy street and began to dance. There was no music playing. No festival or celebration was taking place. She simply started dancing, her arms flailing, her feet stomping, her body twisting in rhythmic, uncontrollable movements. At first, onlookers laughed. They assumed she was drunk or simply seeking attention. But as hours passed and Frau Trophia continued her frenzied dance without pause, amusement turned to concern. She danced through the afternoon and into the evening. She danced until her feet were bloody, her clothes soaked with sweat. And still, she could not stop. By nightfall, Frau Trophia had collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again at dawn and resume her manic dance. Her husband, desperate to help her, carried her to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint believed to have power over physical afflictions. But prayers brought no relief. Local physicians were summoned, but they stood baffled before this strange malady. And then something even more disturbing happened. Within days, other residents of Strasbourg began to dance as well. By the end of the week, 34 people had joined Frau Trophia in her involuntary dance. Men, women, young, old, the affliction seemed to strike indiscriminately. They danced in the streets, in the marketplaces, outside the cathedral. They danced without music, without joy, without purpose. And most terrifying of all, they danced without the ability to stop. These weren't revelers enjoying themselves. These were people trapped in their own bodies, forced to move until they collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise and begin again when their bodies allowed. Contemporary accounts describe the victims screaming in pain, begging for help, their faces contorted in agony as their bodies refused to obey their desperate desire to be still. Some danced until they broke their ribs. Others suffered strokes or heart attacks. Many danced until blood seeped through their shoes, leaving crimson footprints on the cobblestones of Strasbourg. By the end of July, the dancing plague had spread to approximately 400 people. The city was in chaos. Businesses closed as owners and workers alike succumbed to the mysterious affliction. Families were left without providers as breadwinners danced themselves to injury or death. The city's hospitals and almshouses were overwhelmed with the injured and dying, all victims of their own uncontrollable movements. The authorities of Strasbourg were desperate to contain the situation. They consulted with the city's most respected physicians, who offered a diagnosis that seems bizarre to modern ears. The doctors concluded that the dancers were suffering from hot blood, a condition they believed was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors. And their prescribed treatment was perhaps even more shocking than the malady itself. They recommended more dancing. The logic, according to medical understanding of the time, was that the afflicted needed to dance the sickness out of their systems. Once they had exhausted the hot blood through continuous movement, they would naturally recover. To facilitate this cure, the city council took an extraordinary step. They commandeered guild halls and constructed a wooden stage in the center of the city. They hired musicians to play day and night and professional dancers to accompany the afflicted. They even brought in strong men to hold up those who were too weak to stand but whose bodies still twitched with the compulsion to dance. This well-intentioned intervention proved catastrophic. The music and the presence of professional dancers didn't cure the afflicted. It worsened the situation by encouraging more people to join the macabre dance. The plague spread faster than ever. The city's death toll mounted as dancers succumbed to exhaustion, dehydration, heart failure, and strokes. Contemporary chronicles report that at the height of the plague, as many as 15 dancers were dying each day. The dancing continued for approximately 3 months. As summer turned to autumn, the phenomenon gradually began to subside. Fewer new cases appeared, and some of the afflicted finally found their bodies returning to their control. By early September, the dancing had largely stopped, leaving behind dozens of dead and many more with injuries and trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The dancing plague of 1518 was not the first such event in European history, nor would it be the last. Similar outbreaks had been recorded in the Rhine Valley and other parts of what is now Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But none reached the scale or claimed as many lives as the Strasbourg incident. So, what exactly happened in Strasbourg during those terrible summer months of 1518? What could cause hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably until they died? Modern historians and medical researchers have proposed several theories, none of which fully explain all aspects of this bizarre event. One of the most common explanations involves ergot fungus, a parasite that grows on rye and related grains. Ergot contains compounds similar to LSD and can cause hallucinations, spasms, and convulsions when consumed. The summer of 1518 followed a period of severe food shortages in the region, which may have led people to consume contaminated grain they would normally have discarded. However, ergot poisoning typically causes muscle contractions and seizures rather than the coordinated, dance-like movements described in historical accounts. Another theory suggests that the dancers were members of a heretical religious sect engaging in a form of ecstatic worship that got out of hand. The veneration of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, was common in the region, and some religious practices did involve ritualistic dancing. But this theory fails to explain why the dancers appeared to be in such distress, or why they couldn't stop when they wanted to. Perhaps the most compelling explanation is that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, what was once called mass hysteria. The early 16th century was a time of extreme hardship in Strasbourg and throughout Europe. The region had suffered repeated crop failures, devastating floods, and outbreaks of syphilis and leprosy. Famine was common, and many lived in constant fear of starvation. The Catholic Church taught that Saint Vitus had the power to curse people with a dancing mania, and many believed that the dancing plague was divine punishment for the sins of the community. In this context of extreme stress, religious fear, and widespread suffering, the sight of Frau Trophia dancing uncontrollably in the street might have triggered a psychological response in others who were already on the edge of breakdown. Once the phenomenon began, it spread through a form of social contagion, with the power of suggestion causing vulnerable individuals to manifest similar symptoms. But even this explanation has its weaknesses. Mass psychogenic illness typically affects people who are in close proximity to each other, like students in the same school or workers in the same factory. The dancing plague affected people across an entire city, from different social classes and different neighborhoods. And while psychological factors can certainly cause unusual behaviors, it's difficult to imagine how even the most powerful suggestion could override the body's natural limits to the point of dancing until death. Some researchers have proposed that the dancers might have been suffering from a form of encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain that can cause strange movements and behaviors. Others suggest that the phenomenon might have been a culturally specific stress reaction, similar to conditions like running amok in Southeast Asian cultures or Arctic hysteria among Inuit peoples. The truth is that we may never know exactly what caused the dancing plague of 1518. The event occurred 5 centuries ago, and the medical records and first-hand accounts that survive are filtered through the understanding and beliefs of the time. What we do know is that something extraordinary and terrifying happened in Strasbourg that summer, something that defies simple explanation and continues to baffle historians, psychologists, and medical researchers to this day. Perhaps what makes the dancing plague so disturbing to modern sensibilities is the loss of control it represents. The idea that our own bodies could betray us, that we could be forced to continue an action even as it kills us, strikes at the heart of our sense of autonomy and self-determination. The dancers of Strasbourg were not just victims of a strange malady. They were prisoners in their own flesh, compelled by forces they couldn't understand to dance toward their own destruction. 500 years later, The dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of history's most bizarre and unsettling episodes of mass affliction. It reminds us of the complex interplay between mind and body, between individual psychology and collective behavior. It shows us how vulnerable we can be to forces we don't understand, whether those forces come from contaminated food, psychological stress, infectious disease, or some combination of factors we haven't yet identified. In the end, the dancing plague remains a mystery, a dark moment in history when hundreds of people found themselves caught in a deadly dance they never chose to join and couldn't choose to leave. And perhaps that's why the story continues to fascinate and disturb us centuries later. Because deep down, we all fear that moment when the music starts and we find ourselves dancing to a tune we cannot resist, no matter how desperately we might want to stop.